Welcome everyone. Welcome Dr. Miller. Thanks for joining me. Today we'll be talking about the concept of multifaceted trauma. So in our first episode, we discussed kind of the breadth and complexity that is around the concept of trauma. And today we kind of wanted to peel back those layers a little bit more and talk about the kind of more specific categories of trauma and how the impact shows up in a person's everyday life when they're experiencing that, and how it affects their ability to cope with other kind of stressors in life or just day-to-day experiences. Dr. Miller, I know that you teach a violence and interpersonal violence class here at the university. Can you speak to kind of what are the potential violent experiences people may be facing from infancy to elders, and what we're actually talking about?
Yeah, it's an incredible class, so it's violence across a lifespan. And it starts at infancy. So we do look at a child. The younger the child, the more they are at risk to not be safe in relationships, of course, that aren't healthy. And they're susceptible because, of course, they can't, get up and get the keys and drive away. So they're very dependent on the people that, of course, are closest to them, that we would hope are taking care of them. Unfortunately, sometimes parents aren't able to in a safe, healthy way, or other family members. And we do know that most child abuse, the largest percentage of it is enacted by someone within the family system somewhere. So we take a look at all the different types of abuse that happen to, infants, children, and youth. And that can be psychological, emotional, physical, sexual abuse. And we take a look at how it impacts their development. Prevalence, where we find it might be more prevalent, some of the socioeconomic factors that stress families and, of course, can put them into crisis, which further puts children at risk. We look at the intersectionality of racism and sexism and classism and ableism and sexual orientation and, various stigma and discrimination that occurs and can put our young children at risk, not only in the homes but in the community. So that's one category we look at, is the interpersonal violence. We look at bullying specifically and the impact of cyberbullying. Canada ranks really high around the experience of bullying for their youth. And that's an unfortunate statistic, but we are ranked as one of the top first world countries for the severity or the most prevalence of bullying and online cyberbullying. So we talk about that. Why is it happening? What's its impact? And it has long-term consequences. We look at other abuse that can occur in some of the relationships that our young people have in the world. That can be in sports and or in other community activities. We look at schools and why there can be prevalence of violence in schools, even though schools are one of the safest places for our young people to be, because you have caring, educated people that are looking out for things, that are helping our young people socialize and learn how to be respectful and thoughtful in their interactions. But children can bring certain things into their school relationships where they have potentially been shown or it has occurred to them, some sort of abuse, and they haven't learned, one, how to be able to behave differently, and two, they haven't been able to talk about their own traumatic experiences. So we talk a lot about how schools can be a very significant protective factor, but also there's a risk factor when young people bring in behaviors and or are seeking control over others, because all abuse is about power and control, and we talk a lot about that. All abuse is about power and control, dominance and submission. And then we take a look at our young people, so our young adults, 16 to 24, that age group, as they're emerging into their own lives and they're going to university. We know the university population has a 40-some% risk of experiencing a sexual assault if you're a female-identified person, and we know that male-identified people will be at risk to experiencing assaults, physical assaults out in the community as they emerge as young adults. Those are high statistics. They're also that age group is really high risk around experiencing harassment, sexual harassment, physical harassment, of course, psychological harassment, and abuse in the workplace. because they're young, they're entering into the world, right? Not necessarily knowing how to navigate some of these relationships. And unhealthy people seek to take control and exploit our young adults and young people, which, that in itself has long-term impact. We take a look at abuse in interpersonal relationships, those in your home, your domestic violence, which is in your home relationships, and then also interpersonal could be dating relationships out in the community. We're looking at all types of abuse on adult individuals, young adult individuals as they enter into the world. We look at elder abuse and why, how prevalent it is, why it's there, what can we do to respond to it differently. We look at collective violence. That can be gangs and violence, international violence, how war-related violence, and just looking at how all of that impacts who we are here, but also who we might be connected to in other countries, or as people come and immigrate into Canada, their experiences of having gone through very traumatic experiences in the world because of violence in various communities and countries. And then we also look at sexual exploitation and sex trafficking and human trafficking and the prevalence of that it's something that needs to be talked about. I always say to my students that what I know is that once they're done with this class, that the world is going to be a better place. Because to be able to talk about these topics and to sit there and begin to understand and why is this so prevalent and what are we, looking at when we are trying to work with, right, certain types of violence, and how do we respond differently? How do we start to correct some of this? Because I say prevention is the intervention, not intervention. By the time we're in intervention, we do more of a mop-up. We are just actively trying to work through something that's got long-term impact. If we do prevention, we're looking to stop, right, that impact from happening. So I always know when students are sitting in that class that every one of them now goes into the world with new education, new knowledge about what's happening out there in relation to violence across the lifespan, but they're also looking at ways to prevent it. And they do these fantastic presentations on topics of choice, and they speak to it, and they create dialogue around it. And I always say to them, if you can speak about any of these topics, you can speak to anything in this world and at university and beyond. Because to be prepared to speak to topics that are complicated, hard to talk about, very emotional for some people, feeling very vulnerable, and to support their classmates and to support each other, to develop that capacity is superior. It's like something that allows them to develop their capacities as adults and humans in this world.
Sounds like a very unique class, especially, I think, considering a lot of people, when they hear the term violence, it's usually followed by kind of a physical connotation. It's some sort of physical violence interaction between two people. But like you just explained, there's such a breadth to the idea of violence, especially across the lifespan. And like you mentioned, kind of in youth, the prevalence of the online presence of bullying, and kind of when people are emerging adults going to university, just the different life stages and how that would really open individuals up to different types of violence is super interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, as young people come into education, there's sort of like this open palette of, what is this world about? And yet we do a lot of work around media literacy, looking at how articles in the newspaper shape out our understanding of different types of violence and why we need to ask questions more than know the answer. Because the questions help us to understand, why is this happening to certain people? And we also look at intergenerational trauma and transgenerational trauma across the generations, and the impact of colonization. And Mount Royal University is extremely strong in its indigenization process, so really honoring the lives of Indigenous people and the impact of colonization. And we talk about racial violence and all of the impact of the intergenerational trauma on our Indigenous community in Canada. So students are again learning to look at different types of violence and historically how it's impacted people, and then how that continues to carry forth in today's society, and how we need to be actively looking at truth and reconciliation and owning responsibility, right, around any violence that we may be a part of, or historically that we understand now as an impact, and how do we become part of the future and the change and the prevention.
You used the word interaction earlier. So how whether it's the environment or what's around someone is interacting to maybe exacerbate some sort of violence that they're experiencing, or maybe how things are compounding. And you bring in the example of the Indigenous community and their intergenerational trauma. That's one subgroup that experiences a lot of compounded violence and traumatic events over decades. Can you speak to what is really happening in someone's lived experience when violence or traumatic events are compounding on each other?
Well, there's lots to that question, and I think to be very mindful in the answer that I can't speak to another person's cultural experience, but I can speak to what I know from the information that I've been able to understand over the years and from the Indigenous community themselves. But if we place this idea of compounding trauma and intergenerational, what we know from research is that if someone has gone through significant abuse, like childhood abuse, and that if their family system has as well, everything gets compounded. So it's like, if I only know what I know, and this is what I've learned from those that care about me because they've been hurt by others, and now that pain they have not been able to heal and find ways to work it through, then that pain continues across the generations. And research is coming out of Harvard around transgenerational impact, which means our genetics are actually changed by the impact of living through traumatic experiences, so that genetically there's a change. If you look at this idea of epigenetics, the genetics of who we are, right? We come with our genetics based on our family system, but if it's changed from traumatic experience, it already means that we're going to be more susceptible to things that may happen to us, and it compounds, right? Brings forth more changes, biological and psychological. And then the around epigenetics is risk and protective factors. So if I come with my genetic impact from the trauma that my family and their family has come through, and I'm still at risk because we face, let's say, poverty and unaddressed mental health and maybe some addiction concerns, and we're not safe in our communities, that risk factor further impacts who I am. And then it could limit some of my capacity to live a full, well life, because the protective factors, which would be good schools, safe spaces, enough income for food security, opportunities in education, they can't offset the impact, the genetic, transgenerational, and the risk factors because of racism, discrimination, violence in communities, et cetera, et cetera.
So when we're talking about specific experience, so maybe the experience of sexual abuse that's impacting an individual, if we're to hone in on a specific type, how is maybe sexual abuse impacting an individual's healing journey and their ability to form trusting relationships? Because we're talking a lot about the compounding effect. So now what's happening on the kind of a micro level when people are facing sexual abuse and then forming a trusting relationship?
Right. So sexual abuse is a very complicated topic, and one that I can't do, the depth of discussion that would be needed to fully understand, all of how it impacts people, but I think I'll speak to it in a general sense. The baseline of sexual abuse is someone takes away your right to be safe in your body. That's the bottom line. And so when a child is not allowed the right to be safe in their body, they carry that internally, sometimes for the rest of their life. If you're not safe in your body and we are interacting with other adults, let's say it's, young adults and they're dating, and someone has experienced sexual abuse that they have not been able to fully address and heal, and that gets bound into shame and feeling that, something is wrong with me, or sometimes they can't even remember all the details, but they know that they weren't safe in their body and that someone used power and control over them. What happens is that anytime they're looking to interact with another adult, their immediate response can be not trusting someone. If you don't trust someone, you may not ask for what you need, like in safety, and just do what are your needs? I need more time, more space, more a sense of knowing you, knowing myself in this relationship. So sexual abuse, because it takes away your right to be safe in your body, and so much developmental trauma occurs around that exact, type of abuse, that it continues across the lifespan. And sometimes does not fully heal in a way that, one, you'll never not remember it, but two, so you could feel fully safe in your body again, so you could experience yourself fully with another person. And that, takes a lot of healing and work for people to be able to work that through and to find, safe people to have relationships with and to be even able to talk about it with the person they care about. Mm-hmm. So then we might avoid relationships or pick the wrong relationship or numb out of relationships. There's lots of ways people try and cope in the best way possible, given the resources that they have. And it may not always be healthy. And within that becomes more suffering. Because why am I like this? Why do I bring relationships into my life that don't seem to be healthy? Why can't I ask for respect? And underneath that is still the healing. What happened to you? And let's go back into that and try and help through various therapeutic ways and trauma-focused care to help people reclaim that power, that right to be safe in their body and in their relationships.
Right. And then we're hearing this pattern again come up of power dynamics and these themes around shame and guilt being an outcome for the victim of the sexual abuse as well. Mm-hmm. Just changing gears here to domestic violence now. What are kind of some common patterns and dynamics that you typically see that are present when working with domestic violence? And how are people kind of, where would you point them in terms of resources available to seek any support or safety or sense of safety when they don't have that in the household?
Again, domestic violence is another very complicated topic in the overarching theme of violence across the lifespan. I've done a lot of work in this area. Some of my initial practice was in shelters, really looking at that harsh reality of when there is domestic violence and how there can be a physical and, of course, psychological, spiritual, sexual impact on individuals. And you look at all domestic violence relationships are about power and control. Someone taking away someone else's right to be safe, to be respected, to be valued, to be loved, to be heard in the world around what they need. And depending on the complexity of that abuse, because we know around domestic violence, some of it can be fatal, and that people die because of domestic violence. So it's a significant topic in the helping professions. How can we prevent this? But also the intervention, because the intervention in domestic violence is what can save a life. To have a family, let's just say a mother and children go to a shelter, to have a parent and children go to a shelter to be safe. It's important, it's crucial that we have immediate resources that can go out to help people be safe in that moment of, intense terror and violence. But we also look at the prevention side of it. What do we need for education? How do we go into schools and develop educational capacity to help our young people know what's a healthy relationship, what is not? And again, when you go back to the act of abuse itself, is the need for control over another individual. So you also want to work with those that are becoming abusive. Where, do they need to go back in and relearn how to manage through that need to control another person? How were they raised? What came into their world? That has caused them to, not be able to use anger and or find other ways to articulate emotions and, needs that they have. So you're trying to work with all components of a family system, relationship systems, so that every person gets some care. And children that witness or are part of any sort of domestic violence, we call it family violence, they too need important care. Because to witness means it's a qualifier for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And our children are like little sponges, and they kind of just take it all in and it gets frozen in there. And then somewhere in their story, they have to work it through. And sometimes, of course, children only have a certain amount of capacity to do that. They may not be able to articulate they're afraid or articulate the story. So you'll see really good therapeutic responses like play therapy, equine therapy processes. There's all sorts of things they're doing with children with EMDR. You'll see, various therapeutic responses that let children bring forward the impact in ways that are more age appropriate, more developmentally appropriate. And yet some of that goes across a lifespan and it impacts how they have relationships with their peers and or people that they are looking to have some sort of ongoing relationship with. And I think something else that's important in this category is what research tells us is one of the most significant contributing factors to domestic violence, interpersonal violence, and those domestic relationships is alcohol. If there is a higher percentage or higher usage of alcohol, the correlation with interpersonal violence is quite high. It's one of your correlating factors, which means if it's there in a significant way, it actually usually correlates directly with interpersonal violence.
Mm-hmm. So we can see a big compounding effect there as well.
Yes.
And when we talk about family violence, you've kind of pointed to the importance of catering a treatment approach for the developmental age of the individual and the family. The family system is a really important factor to contribute into the treatment process as well.
Mm-hmm. It's essential to go back into the family because the whole of the family experiences the interpersonal violence. And even it's not necessarily that each person is directly impacted, but the indirect impact for children is as substantial as the direct. And they hear those raised voices, they hear the screaming, the police coming to the house. They're impacted by all of that. And you'll see the hypervigilance they have when they hear just a general fire truck in the community. For them now, they can go back through and re-experience the events of the evening, the screaming before the event. All of that gets encoded in their minds and bodies.
Yeah, like you mentioned, that they're almost sponges because when children are at the developmental period where there is a critical period where they're really taking in everything in their environment, whether they know it or not.
Yes.
You talked a little bit about the role of alcohol. Changing gears to a different category within the multifaceted trauma topic, what are some of the effective approaches for actually addressing alcohol and drug addiction or addiction in general, behavioral addiction, as a response to trauma? So what are some resources people can tap into for recovery in addressing addiction in response to trauma?
Again, this is a field of its own, and early intervention, prevention. So prevention comes with education. Prevention comes with good programs for our young people to explore their concept of self through sports, music, it doesn't matter, hobbies, community practices where they feel good about the person they are. And then you go into those younger or those teen years and really trying to help young people understand some of the impact of substances on their brain and body, knowing that they are seeking to explore, right, some of the sense of self to try out things that might be a little more risky. So how do we bring in as much education and help them develop other ways of experiencing themselves in healthier ways? And then if an addiction is already active to some degree, again, you're looking at early intervention. As soon as you suspect something is going on, we need as much supports as we can in the areas that young people will be engaged in. Everything from universities to high schools to, it doesn't matter, sports teams to music resources to, any sort of social process that you have an adult that cares, that can support our young people to understand things with education material or ways to engage them in the act of learning, right? And then, of course, if the addiction is active, sometimes it's intervention, which is people need to go to some sort of treatment program or have a process that's very engaged and active to help them understand how to be able to limit, right, the substance use itself, but also exploring at what else is going on. Because mental health and trauma sit very close to, unaddressed, sometimes sit very close to various addictions that people will struggle with. So also going in there and doing some healing. Lots of the research around very active use, and even some of our folks that are really struggling socially and are engaged in some very serious addiction processes. If you pull back some of that top layer, you see a lot of traumatic experiences that they did not get support with. Mm-hmm. And we know that. And it's key not only to do the addiction treatment, but to go underneath that and look for the other ways that people have been impacted and are suffering. And so it takes a lifetime to heal that. Mm-hmm. It's not just a one-up treatment program. There's ongoing care in the community and mentorship and, support programs in the community and peer support. They're, again, very multifaceted. The whole of society has to respond, not just the, treatment program.
Right. And you spoke a bit to children, especially youth or children who are experiencing some sort of traumatic event early in life, or an ACE, as we call it, adverse childhood experiences. They are more prone to show these impulsive behaviors later in life if they've experienced, violence in the home or some sort of abuse early in life. A lot of the time they don't know what it is that happened to them, and then will exhibit these impulsive behaviors later in life as well. Mm-hmm. And we do have that episode coming up for lifespan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, has been such a phenomenal piece of research, and it's now long-standing. And really the bottom line is the more of the ACEs, so the adverse childhood experiences that you've experienced, the greater the risk that you will find yourself living with mental health and addiction concerns, but also chronic health issues, and you have a shorter lifespan. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is wrong. That someone who didn't get a choice not to be impacted by violence will not live out their life in the same way that someone, a peer, that was not impacted. Because remember, it's not a choice in childhood to have these experiences to come into your life. They get put into your life because you're vulnerable, young or vulnerable, and then they're not protected. And then if you thought about that they have a lower lifespan, right? That their years of living will be less. That in itself is something that we socially need to think about and do everything we can to prevent impact.
Mm-hmm. The final category of the multifaceted trauma that we're looking at today is how grief and loss shows up for individuals who have experienced trauma and the compounding effect of that. When people who have undergone some traumatic experience undergo a type of loss, whether that's loss of a job, friendship, pet, a loved one, how is that showing up, and how can people who are navigating the compounding effects of grief and trauma identify some coping strategies? What does that look like, and how does that show up?
Well, I always say this, that if it's a traumatic loss, you have to heal the trauma in order to fully allow the grief to come out. And with traumatic experience and traumatic loss, there is a lot of grief work to do. So if there's been a traumatic loss, it's like you need to go back in and work through the impact of what you've seen, what you've known, how it happened, etc. Then around that is the grief that goes with not having that person or that experience in your life. But in a general sense, there's also grief and loss around traumatic impact. Because if you think of a child and having to experience some sort of traumatic abuse in their early on life, whatever format that is, the loss of innocence, right? The loss of that childhood, because they become afraid, they hide, they avoid, they no longer can go into rooms and feel safe, right? They don't just go play and enjoy whatever that is. They're thinking about when they get home, what's going to happen, how bad it was the night before. There's a lot of grief work when you go in to do work around trauma. And so grief and loss is to lose someone and to grieve. Grieving is a normal emotional experience. It gets a little more complicated when there's traumatic experiences around it, and traumatic experiences themselves have a certain amount of grief and loss in them. And you'll see chunks of people's lives where they can't report any joy, and they look forward into the future and they don't see it as joyful. So that's a lot of loss work there, like in a loss around experience and grieving that needs to be done, as well as other grief and loss that we go through.
Right. So it's very interwoven, the two
Yes,
concepts.
very much.
And you spoke to how you really need to do the work on the grief before you can do the work on the trauma. If someone is dysregulated, they won't be able to really rationalize and reason what it is that happened to them if they're still in this stress response. Sorry, the trauma and then
Yes,
the grief.
I was
other
just
way
going to
around.
rearrange it.
Yeah. So if someone is coming in super dysregulated from a traumatic experience, they won't be able to fully process the emotions and the experiences they're having from a significant loss.
Yes, that's it exactly. So you go back into the trauma, hold space for safety, allowing them to, right, deconstruct, to bring forward what happened to them, and allow them to feel through some of those emotions that can be terrifying, overwhelming, they're so vulnerable in, and then there will be space for grief.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a common theme within all of the trauma work is if someone is in this heightened arousal state, you really need to do some regulation work to bring them to a place of understanding.
Mm-hmm. And I take it deeper than regulation work. Mm-hmm. I go into the healing part of it because regulation work can be, almost like a therapeutic process to teach someone some skills. Mm-hmm. But to go into some of the healing around trauma, it's deeper than that. It's a safe space where they can go back in and reconstruct, right? It's like go into the impact of what that was and to walk through it not alone, with someone that's willing to share that space with them and to help them therapeutically to re-experience and find safety again, to lift the veil of suffering. And then build in some of your skills and strategies around regulation.
Mm-hmm. With all of these broad topics that we've talked about to really exhibit how multifaceted trauma is, we've seen a lot of themes around that there can be some shame, there can be some guilt, there can be a sentiment of what's wrong with me. Where does the role of self-compassion come in? So we talk about how self-compassion can be really valuable for the healing process from trauma or from violence. Where does that come in, and how can individuals kind of cultivate some self-compassion to contribute to a sense of resilience and recovery?
Yeah, self-compassion is a really good term. A lot of times people will split off parts of themselves that they're ashamed of because they feel they're too emotional, too vulnerable. They should have said something. They didn't stop, what went on. And they judge themselves. It's a way of coping with something that seems so overwhelming to feel through. So self-compassion is to go back in and know you did your best. You were a child. You wouldn't have known what to say. Or you wouldn't have known in a situation when someone took complete control of you what to do, right? You're under the control of the person that has control over you. And so there can be a splitting off of emotions and a real judgment of aspects of self and what you didn't do, should have done, why can't you do, et cetera, or why do I do? So we talk a lot about internal family systems, talks a lot about this, is to bring that part of yourself into the conversation, right? The therapeutic work, the journaling, depending on what you're doing, and to hold self-compassion for that part of yourself that you're judging, that didn't do enough, should have said something, should have yelled louder, shouldn't have gone out at that time of night, whatever it is. And so the self-compassion is part of the healing, to give kindness and love to that part of yourself that you are judging, right, that didn't do something or should have done something. And it's to allow you to become more whole in who you are, to give that back to yourself. And so we talk about cultivating self-compassion and bringing all aspects of self. And lots of people can have a lot of negative self-talk. They've called themselves names and all sorts of things that are very kind of horrific in their own way because they just have felt so much shame in these experiences and why, they couldn't get through it better. And so cultivating compassion for those parts of yourself that you've named in a really hurtful way, and to go in and feel the vulnerability and to bring that part back, right? To feel more whole, to not judge, the person that you were in that experience and the best that you could do to take care of yourself.
And it's a hard thing to do, like you mentioned, like people get in this cycle of negative self-talk for, especially after following a traumatic experience for years and years and years on end. To be able to show oneself self-compassion is very much a process.
Yeah, it's really cultivating it. It's a daily process of making space every day to gift that back to yourself, to choose to provide yourself with self-compassion. And sometimes you need that good therapeutic relationship or a good friendship or a great partner, a pet, something that says you matter. And that also allows you to start, right, a process of, it's like co-developing self-compassion.
Bringing some meaning and purpose into your life.
Yes. Yeah.
And I like the way you put that, gifting it to yourself.
Yes, a big gift.
Big
Yes.
gift. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Do you have any final thoughts for today's episode, Dr. Miller?
Stay safe, be brave, and know that your own right to be safe in this world is really an important part of our lived experience. And I hope that this series gives you more understanding about what is, trauma, and then also how we can heal and give back to ourselves some of that self-compassion and self-healing too that we deserve.
Give yourself that gift.
Yeah, give yourself that gift.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Miller.
you.